Joining me today is Dr. Garen Wintemute, Director of the Violence Prevention Research Program at the University of California, Davis. In addition to being one of just a handful of gun violence researchers in the country, Garen is also an emergency room physician. He's dedicated his career to understanding the drivers of the horrific violence ER doctors like him are all too familiar with. In light of the near miss assassination attempt on former President Trump, I wanted to talk about political violence and some of the science behind what we see manifesting in our country over the last several years. Garen, thanks so much for making time to talk. And I'd like to jump right in and ask about the intersecting factors that you're seeing drive gun violence. What are they? And are we at an inflection point for political violence in the US?
Sure. First, Jess, thanks for having me. We started studying political violence here because we study gun violence. Let me give just a smidge of origin story. When the pandemic started, we expected firearm purchasing to go through the roof because people buy guns when they're scared. And it did, and we tracked that phenomenon. We linked it to the increase in violence that occurred later during the pandemic. And purchases continued through the end of 2020, which was an election year, and that always happens. But they didn't taper off in 2021. That was the signal for us. There's something we've never seen before in gun purchasing. And I dove down a rabbit hole and ran across a body of work I hadn't encountered related to political violence. In brief, people who were experts in political violence in other countries had developed statistical models for predicting when it would happen and so on, took a look at the US and were aghast at finding that we were much further along the road toward political violence here than they had thought. As one person put it, a lot of people want to see January 6th as the end of something. We need to see it as the beginning of something. So we were off to the races. And for the last 3 years, we just got 2024 data a couple of weeks ago, we've been doing large-scale, nationally representative, longitudinal surveys, so we're following the same people through time, of support for political violence, willingness to engage personally in political violence, and then a whole bunch of information about the respondents. So to finally answer your question directly, what we're discovering to be risk factors for political violence, I talk about it as a health problem. We have a risk factor for a health problem. Being male, duh. Being younger rather than older. But then things get more complicated. Republicans more than Democrats, conservatives more than liberals, MAGA Republicans in particular. People who, this won't surprise listeners, viewers, people who espouse racism, white supremacy, Christian nationalists are all at increased risk for supporting violence, political violence, and for engaging in it. Given our interest in firearm violence, we obviously asked firearm owners and compared them to non-owners. By a very small margin, firearm owners are more supportive of political violence than non-owners, but where the margins get much, much wider is among firearm owners. People who own assault-type rifles, people who bought guns during the pandemic, and people who carry loaded firearms in public all the time are at substantially increased risk of supporting political violence and willingness to participate in it.
Wow. Okay. So that is, I mean, some of it makes sense, and it's expected, and other insights there are a little bit more surprising. There's some subtlety there. And so I'm really interested in what you found as far as a link between presidential election years and cycles and firearm purchases.
Yes. Let me restate something that I said a moment ago. People buy guns out of fear more than for all other reasons put together. But there are at least two general types of fear involved here. There's the one we all immediately think of. I want to protect myself, my family, etc. But there's also fear at the political policy level. Firearm purchasing always goes up in a presidential election year. That wasn't something new in 2020. It's really obvious, and we have a figure in one of the papers to show it. It was really obvious in 2016. The fear is that, gee, maybe the quote, gun control, unquote, candidate will win, and I won't be able to buy next year the guns that I can buy this year, so I'm going to accelerate the purchase. So that happened in 2020, that spike. Remember a couple of things about 2020. First off, we had a violent election season culminating in an armed assault on the Capitol incited by the sitting president. It was a contested election. But the other thing is the gun control candidate did win, so unlike 2016. So we weren't at all surprised that purchasing went up and stayed up sort of December, January, the inauguration. But it was the fact that it didn't revert to normal as we went into spring and summer of 2021, which it always has before, that caught our attention. So we started exploring the literature in the summer of 2021, and by fall, we're committed to doing the survey work.
Wow. Okay. So there is something that's happening in the data that's different, and obviously with any kind of research, there can be difficulties with certain data sources. And so I know that a lot of times federal firearm background check data is used to help quantify the number of guns that are sold, but that data is not perfect. Can you explain why it doesn't capture everything?
Yes, those are the data we used. I should have been clear. For imperfect data, they're really pretty good. But let me explain first off what they are, because maybe not everybody knows, and then I'll explain some of the major flaws. Any purchase through a licensed retailer, and in some states, all purchases have to go through licensed retailers by law, requires a background check at some point, usually at the time of purchase. And the mechanics of how the background check are conducted and who conducts it vary, but it produces a record one way or the other. And in the National Instant Criminal Background Check System database, which is run by the FBI. And those data are made public. Actually, tax dollars at work, detailed counts by state, and if I recall correctly, by type of gun, are available monthly, typically on about the second working day of the following month. It's really quite remarkable. So those were the data we were following. The flaws, first off, it's important to say the flaws haven't changed over time. So if what you're looking at is change over time, the flaws are built in. There are two main flaws. There are other smaller ones. One is only purchases through a licensed retailer are recorded. They're the only ones who generate a background check. And in many states, it's legal, unfortunate but legal, to buy a gun without a background check. It's easy in many states. It's illegal, but easy to buy a gun if you're a prohibited person. You just buy it from a private party. You don't tell them you're prohibited. They're too smart to ask you the question. So there's that problem. But the other is that one background check is done per transaction, not per gun. I might buy 25 guns, I might buy one gun, there's still one background check. And there's disagreement on what ought to be the correction factor for that. How many guns on average are bought in a transaction? Is it 1.5? Is it 2? It's probably somewhere between there. Nobody knows. The estimates based on the range could vary quite a bit. Everybody agrees the number of guns per transaction probably hasn't changed a bunch. So we just take the errors as baked into the data and go with them.
Wow. Okay. And then I know that some firearms, people can 3D print them now. So that probably adds a whole different wrinkle to what you're doing.
Well, let me add a bigger wrinkle before I get to that then. If we're talking about recording transfers of guns, the other thing that background checks, just to state something that'll be really obvious, the other thing that the background checks don't capture is transactions in the criminal gun market. So I might buy a gun legally, I might sell it to a private party who then sells it illegally to somebody else, and it's in the criminal gun market, or it might get stolen out of my house and enter the criminal gun market. It can go through lots of criminal transactions, all of which are unrecorded before it's used in a crime, and it's at risk for use during all that time. So not in the background check data. But the initial sale of the new gun is in there, some years back, let's say. But then ghost guns, yes. The most insightful thing ever said about ghost guns was said by a supporter of them, who in sort of Reddit conspiratorial language said, the only gun you really own is the one they don't know about. That's the purpose of ghost guns. They can be made by 3D printing. They can be made by taking partially finished component parts and with relatively little skill and little time, machining them and producing a complete firearm. There are some other production methods, but yes, ghost guns are not made by a manufacturer. They are, in essence, made by a private individual. They have no paper trail. There's no serial number. There are no manufacturer's marks. They can't be traced if they're used in a crime, and that is precisely the point. That's why they exist, to fuel a market where the customers are people who want to have guns without anybody knowing.
Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for some serious problems. And so I know that everybody is really tuned into political violence right now, but how has the general trend for all firearm related violence gone over the last 5 to 10 years or so?
I want to extend the time horizon just a little bit. We had historically high, higher than they had ever been before, rates of firearm violence in the mid-1990s, early to mid-1990s. And then those rates went down. In the 20th century, in most of the country, rates have gradually drifted back up until we hit the pandemic. And I'll talk about the pandemic in just a second. In California, where we have a really robust regulatory regime, rates did not drift upward during the early 21st century. They continued downward. There's a real divergence. But come the pandemic, rates went up everywhere. We had the largest ever single year increase in firearm homicide ever in 2020, both in absolute terms and relative terms. And we hit that landmark for firearm suicide in 2021. So all-time highs that by a small margin, but did exceed the rates of the early 90s. Since then, we've seen a gradual trend downward. The trend has not been uniform. The most recent data are from 2022, the most recent good data. And we're sort of in oscillation around that high point. We are down from the peaks of 2020, 2021. It's not at all clear that we're going to be reverting to some earlier low point.
Huh. Okay. I'm liking the perspective and I'm sort of digesting it. So I also saw in one of your papers, it was in the journal Injury Epidemiology, and you mentioned a possible driver of the unrest that can lead to political violence. And something that you wrote in there really jumped out at me, and that was, quote, many Americans have entered a world of paranoid delusion, a world that exists because, as sociologist Zeynep Tufekci describes it, belonging is stronger than facts. So how does this shift away from facts drive violence?
Because the shift is to a tribal, violence-prone worldview that is driven by conspiracy, that is driven by mistrust. These are themes that we're all becoming familiar with, that is driven by deliberate disinformation. The poster child for this in our work, and not just in our work, is belief in the QAnon delusion, that the government and the media and financial and social institutions are controlled by satanic pedophiles who traffic children for sex. There was a time when I would have embarrassed to even say those words out loud for recording. And I have to say, when we designed our first survey, my colleague said, you can't put that question in a questionnaire. And I said, well, we're going to do it because we need to know, but also it's been done before. We didn't invent that question. And that's a fair summary of the QAnon delusion. Somewhere between 7 and 10% of adults still today strongly agree with that outlandish statement that I just made. And that's including, we've had a very first preliminary look at the 2024 data. So still today, as we move into another election season. If one believes, don't mean to personalize, that society is run by evil people, a thought experiment for the audience. Does that, if one believes that society is run by evil people who commit violence against children, how does that shape one's worldview? Does that shape one's worldview toward or away from committing violence? I think the answer is fairly obvious. And that's the sort of stuff that we've been seeing. That's the sort of stuff that columnist was commenting on. The delusions we have are delusions that predispose us toward violence. Tribalism is at the root of them. It's also, you and I are talking about political violence, but there's a broader layer of the pyramid below it, which is identity violence. That, and I use tribalism as kind of a shortcut for that, but a belief that takes all sorts of forms, that the people who are not like me are in some way constitute a threat to me. I am justified in my hostility toward them. And actually, let me extend one step further. A paper that at the moment is only out as a preprint. It's public, but it's not peer reviewed yet. We're still working on some refinements. In 2023, we looked simultaneously in our population at racism and hostile sexism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism, all of those things at the same time. To my knowledge, that's never been done before. And we'll be reporting broadly on that. Our interest is in political violence. And to sum up, what we found is, first off, all 7 of those things are much more common in our society than people think they are, let alone that we would like them to be. And all 7 of them, each of them and all of them together with synergy, are very strongly tied to our primary outcome measures, support for political violence and willingness to commit it.
Wow. That's actually a very interesting look at all of it, to see how it all relates. And we
Yes.
need that. It's that intersectionality that seems to be at the heart of a lot of research these days. And it seems like that's really tying it all in. And, I've heard it said for years, and I've said it myself because I've thought it was very accurate, that gun violence is an epidemic. It's a public health crisis. And so has this always been the case in the United States? I mean, we've had a long history with firearms here, but is this a more recent change that we've had this epidemic?
Let me start at a slightly different spot. No, I'm going to answer your question directly. We have always had a problem with firearm violence. The rates in the era of data recording, rates have been highest in the 1920s, which is when we first get decent national mortality data. In the 1960s, early 1970s, in the late 80s to early 90s, and again in the period that may or may not be just ending, but we seem to be on the downhill slope of. Recognition of firearm violence as a health problem is much more recent. As a practical matter, the first paper that said firearm violence is a public health problem was published in 1980 by people I studied under at Johns Hopkins. Before that time, and by many people still today, there's no aggregation. There's crime and there's suicide. We don't even have a public story about suicide. And I'm old enough to remember when people talked about suicide as culling the herd, a term that we don't hear now. But it took the public health approach to say, excuse me, these things and unintentional injuries and hunting and stuff, there's a common denominator here. Let's think about host, agent, vehicle, vector, environment, and firearms play a role here. And that's not magic. The point of adopting such an approach is to see, does it have explanatory power? Does it lead to specific answerable research questions? Would the answers to those research questions allow us to intervene and prevent people from being injured and die, whether you call that a public health problem or not, or just a medical problem? And as it has turned out, in fact, the answers to all of those questions are yes, the model works. So I think people would probably say that firearm violence is endemic in the United States. And just literally in the last few days since the assassination attempt, I've started reframing what we're trying to do here as, among other things, an effort to prevent political violence from becoming endemic. We won't zero it out, but we can hopefully minimize it. But there's still resistance to the idea that firearm violence is a health problem. I'm encountering plenty of resistance to the idea that political violence can be viewed as a health problem. In the last 2 weeks, I've had reviewers of manuscripts say, why are they talking about this as a public health problem? One reviewer said, we have a manuscript under review about civil war, which you might want to talk about as part of our research. And one reviewer said, civil war is not a public health problem. Studying civil war is not a public health topic. It was sort of, oh, okay. I fought that fight about firearm violence 40 years ago. You want to go down again about political violence? Happy to do it.
I mean,
but that's fine. That's what pushing the envelope means.
I mean, just look how many people died in the last Civil War. I'd say that's a public health problem.
So the smartest statement of the position that violence is a public health problem came from Dr. David Satcher right after he had been named head of CDC in the early 1990s, when we were then experiencing all-time highs. And he said to the New York Times, look, if violence isn't a public health problem, then why are all these people dying from it? You know, today, or in 2022, let me be technically correct, we lose more people to firearm violence in the United States, we lost in 2022, than we did to breast cancer. And I don't mean to demean the tragedy of breast cancer, but I think firearm violence is a health problem.
Yeah, and you will get no argument from me, or I think from any of our listeners here at UCS. But you made me think of something else. It's actually a great segue here. So based on your research, how many people in the United States believe that political violence is justified sometimes or all the time or whenever versus the number of people who believe it's never justified? What have you seen, and has it changed at all?
Yes. So there's some good news in our research. As you said, we asked people, do you think it's justified? Sometimes, usually, always. But we gave people specific objectives. How about to do this, accomplish this political purpose, like put Donald Trump back in office? But there were, in the 24 survey, there were 21 of them. In 2022, 1/3 of our respondents said that violence, which we defined, physical force, not shouting at somebody, sufficient to hurt somebody, that violence was usually or always justified to advance at least one political objective. And of those who said it was justified for one, on average, they said it was justified for 6. The good news is that in 2023, that went down from 1 in 3 to 1 in 4. It's about 25% in 2023. And we've had just the merest quick look at the 2024 data. It's an election year. We sort of expected things to get worse. I don't see that signal that support for political violence is increasing. So if I can step back and interpret, the really good news here for the vast majority of us is that support for political violence, let alone willingness to engage in it, is an extreme behavior. It's another set of extreme beliefs. Those of us who reject political violence, the vast majority of the country, need to help create a climate of intolerance for violence that will decrease the chance that it will happen.
That is a profound and I think actually helpful statement for people to hear. We can do something about it. And that's the fundamental problem I see people wrestling with, is feeling helpless these days. And nobody wants that. So
yeah, I'm aware of that. We've been writing for months now, and a whole lot in the last week and a half, about precisely that point, that at a time of crisis, people of goodwill want to do something. They want to make something better. And I'm going to very quickly build a case here. If violence is a health problem, then the decision to engage in violence, the decision to support violence, is a health behavior. We actually know a ton about how to influence health behavior, don't know to what extent what we know about how to influence smoking and drinking and other things will translate to the decision to participate in violence. But what we do know is that individual decisions for health behaviors are susceptible to influence by what the people around that individual think and what they say. So family, friends, close social network, respected public leaders, elected officials. I've just listed all of us. We all have the job to become, if you will, influencers. And one-on-one in our individual networks, influence people to move away from violence in general. And some of us will find a very specific challenge that somebody is planning violence, in which case it's not just influence. If there's a concrete threat involved, we all have the duty to communicate that threat to somebody who can do something about it, which is probably law enforcement. But there actually is a lot that each and every one of us not just can do, but should do, starting today.
All right. Well, I'm gonna ask you about that specifically in a little bit. So we'll save that, but we're coming back. But I'm interested to know, are you seeing any new areas for studying violence that is specifically politically motivated? Are there new avenues of inquiry that have opened up in the last few years that you'd like to pursue?
To be honest, everything that we've talked about is new to the field. I mean, the public health, injury epidemiology, the sort of fields that I would describe myself as working in, are just coming to terms with the idea that political violence should be part of our scope of work, and there isn't agreement about that. For us, it has meant, and I think will continue to mean, thinking more broadly about risk factors. So again, the public health approach to any problem says identify all the risk factors that you can, because knowledge is power. Which of those are amenable to change? Which of those risk factors can be affected so that the effect they have on your primary behavior of interest can be modified or zeroed out? And in this work, some of those risk factors are beyond what public health usually thinks about. So I've mentioned that Republicans are more likely than Democrats on balance. That's a generalization. MAGA Republicans more likely than non-MAGA Republicans, let alone Democrats. And that statement applies kind of across the board, regardless of the objective. But health professionals, health researchers, aren't used to thinking about political identity as a risk factor for health behavior. It is in this case. And the question is going to be, are we willing to grapple with that in the way we've grappled with other risk factors? Are we willing to, to study it, to comment on it, to think about its implications? How do we uncouple, this is really important. If a risk factor cannot be affected itself, how do we uncouple that risk from its consequences, from the behavior that might follow? And I'm talking theoretically here. I have no idea how to apply that to partisan identity. I'll mention this. We discovered this literally yesterday in the 2024 data. We asked in the questionnaire, we asked people about party identification first, Republican, Democrat, and Independent. Republicans and Democrats were asked strong or not so much. Independents were asked, which way do you lean? But that was all set up. Republicans were asked, do you identify as a MAGA Republican? The Republicans who said no, and everybody who didn't identify as Republican, were asked, do you identify as part of the MAGA movement, taking it away from its partisan identity? Because there is a broader MAGA movement. And we took a first look at our Civil War data yesterday. It's the first data we've looked at. And the group most expecting a civil war, the group most likely to endorse the statement that the United States needs a civil war to set things right, that's a direct quote, that's the language they saw. wasn't MAGA Republicans, it was non-Republican members of the MAGA movement by a wide margin.
Wow.
So who are these people? Don't know. We made that discovery yesterday. So we're going to be headed into some uncharted territory. Frankly, to me, that's part of the fun of doing the work.
Yeah, that is actually a little bit staggering to hear that, because it has felt like there's been a schism in the Republican Party as of late, as just a casual observer might say. And so I'm really interested to see where that data takes you. So why don't you expand a little bit on the concept of a civil war in the 21st century in the United States? Tell me what you
Sure.
know.
Okay. So when we dove down that rabbit hole in 2021 and we were learning about the work that had been done by specialists in violence in other countries that you and I discussed earlier, a lot of them were specialists in large-scale civil conflict. They had statistical models to predict the occurrence of a civil war in another country, and they turned those models on the U.S. and went, "Uh-oh, we're in trouble." So it sort of started with civil war for us, in part. So in 2022, we asked people how much they agreed with this statement. In the next few years, there will be civil war in the United States, period. That's a direct quote. 1 adult in 6 strongly or very strongly agreed with that statement. Are you kidding me? It's not on anybody's radar. And here's 15%-ish of the population. So in 2023, and 2022 is an election year. In 2023, we asked that question again to monitor trends. We're contacting the same people over time, so it's real change in individuals. And we added the question, how much do you agree with the United States needs a civil war to set things right? The percentage expecting civil war fell from about 15% to about 6%. Good news, but not an election year. Of those who still expected civil war in 23, almost 40% also strongly agreed with the idea that we need one. Okay, so small numbers, small percentage of society, about 3%-ish, but 3%, there's a group, the 3%ers, right? I mean, that's a myth, by the way, but about the revolution. But enough people to cause a lot of trouble. Not an election year. So this year, we repeated those two questions. And we added a bunch more, having to do with things like, what will you do if one breaks out? Will you leave the country? Will you become a combatant? Will you kill somebody from the other side? Which side would you be on? And we're just starting to take a look. But the good news is that in this election year, as people perceive the risk of political violence going up, and as we've just had a sentinel event of political violence, expectation of civil war did not increase. If anything, it went down a little bit from 6%. We don't have adjusted numbers, so I may modify that later, but it's going to be close to that. Did not go up. And the same for the idea that we need one among those who think one is coming. So that's really good news. I'm going to be working on the manuscript today. We're going to get it out as soon as we can, because I think with our 2024 data, what we're going to be able to offer to the country is some reassurance. Yes, the media are, what the media are reporting is really scary right now. But if you go out and ask 8,000 people, which is what we've done, support for political violence is not increasing. So think of it as an extreme position. Expectation of support for civil war is not just extreme, but rare. So what are the rest of us going to do to make sure that the extremists don't take us over the cliff with them?
That was my exact next question, which is, what are some potential solutions that you see for political violence in our world right now? And what can regular folks do to try to tamp down the rhetoric and prevent this stuff from happening?
Perfect. So let me start with what we shouldn't do. There are two things. One is, this is not a time to emigrate. If this country at its best is worth working to preserve, don't leave. It's not a time to leave the country. It's a time to mobilize. And let me talk about the mobilization. Other people have said to me, I just don't want to be involved. And to them, I say, look, nobody gets to be a spectator at the train wreck this time. We are all on the train. And the question is, do the extremists take that train over the cliff with us on it or not? That's up to us, not to them, because they're going to try. So I've got two recommendations for everybody who's watching or listening. One is to be an agent for change, to make your opposition to political violence known to your family, to your friends, over and over again. Some of these conversations will be awkward. It's not going to be easy work, but you have to do it, because the people who are thinking, gee, maybe we should have political violence, will be influenced if the people around them say, no, that's not who we are as a country. That's really important. For people who live on social media, it means becoming a social media influencer for this specific purpose. There are people who are committed to violence. Those people, I think, lie beyond persuasion of the sort that I'm talking about now. But what we know from our research is there's not a lot of them. They're out there, but there aren't a lot of them. If you know them, try and talk them out of it, please. But we have other strategies for such people that typically involve law enforcement, threat assessment, and so forth. But even those strategies, which we can't execute because we're not law enforcement, depend on us, because we are the source of the information that law enforcement can react to identify the person or people planning political violence, just the way we are the source of the tips that law enforcement uses to prevent mass shootings. And oh, by the way, by some definitions, the shooting that occurred Saturday afternoon was a mass shooting, among other things. So I'm asking actually a lot of people. But the first step is, I think, is really easy. And that is for people to make a public commitment to do the work that I've just described. Out loud to themselves, to their friends, I'm going to be part of this. Because again, we all know how to change health behavior. And one of the ways, the health behavior I'm trying to change right at this moment is the behavior of the people who might change the behavior of the people who are going to commit violence. And we know that to get health behavior change started, a public commitment really matters. So what I'm hoping is people will watch or listen to this and turn away from it going, I'm in, I'm going to do my part.
Yeah, that's a great active role we can all play. And I think that's what people need these days. And so this has been fantastic. And we're starting to wrap up here, but I do have a last two-part question that I ask all of my guests here on This Is Science. And you're a scientist, you're a doctor, and our audience is the Union of Concerned Scientists. So, Garen, why are you concerned?
I am an emergency medicine physician. And one of the smartest things ever said about emergency medicine is sometimes being an ER doc is like being the bowman on the Titanic going, hey, look at that iceberg. Whether it's political violence or, as it happens, I played this role for COVID here around where I work, it's our job, both as a clinician and it's my job, both as a clinician and as a scientist, to try and look ahead and see what's coming and let other people know about it. Because if what's coming is bad, we need a strategy either to avert it, prevent it from arriving, and deal with it when it does. And that's why. In this interview with you, I am working to get people involved in a prevention effort. At the same time, with my clinical colleagues, I've been saying, so folks, have you thought about what happens if the mass casualty incident in your catchment area is an act of political violence, of civil conflict with shooters on both sides? Do you understand that could mean a bunch of injured people will arrive at the same time? Well, sure, we got that. But they are, see the air quotes, soldiers. They're combatants. They're armed. They are accompanied by armed friends and defenders. Opponents arrive armed at the hospital. The hospital becomes potentially a scene of combat, generating its own MCI. Have you considered that possibility? So it gets kind of crazy. And you and I are both shaking our heads as I talk because predictions like that sound really outlandish until they happen. And our job is to be ready for the outlandish stuff because, like mass shootings, which only happen in it can't happen here kind of places, if we're not prepared, the event is worse than it would otherwise be.
Yes. Some of our listeners know I'm from Littleton, Colorado, which was one of the original, it wasn't the original, but one of the original, we never thought it could happen here places when it comes to mass shootings. But I really like to end with a bit of optimism here. And I know
Sure.
you've already mentioned a lot that you've been doing, but about your concerns specifically about that ability to see and this and this and this and this and this and worst case scenario, everything. What are you personally doing about those concerns? What helps you sleep at night and get up every morning and keep doing this work?
Yes. I'm an optimist by nature. In this case, my optimism is reinforced by the evidence. You and I have dwelt on some of the scary stuff, but to say again what we've said before, most of us reject political violence. Most of us, about 70% of the people who don't reject it, who say it's justified, go on to say, but I wouldn't want to be involved in it myself. Okay, I can work with that. And you and I have been working with it right here. I do not think that Saturday's shooting was the last instance of political violence we will see this election season. When somebody asks me, is it going to happen again? I just say yes, sort of course, like I would say yes to, are we going to have another mass shooting, to be honest. But our job can't be aspirationally, but forget it. Our job can't be to zero out political violence. Our job can and should be, and frankly just is, to minimize its occurrence and to minimize its effects, to not let this become a society whose political processes are driven by violence, whose election results are driven by violence. That would be a tragedy with effects that will span generations. And I don't think that will happen because I think people are waking up and doing something about it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Garen.
Sure, a pleasure. Thank you.